Okay. So, good morning, Professor Piscatori. So this morning we are having a little bit of discussion about history of Islamic political thought and how are the events that shape the contemporary Muslim world. So, firstly, I would like to thank Professor Piscatori for being with us today, and we feel very fortunate because you are here, because we could have an interview with you.
Well, thank you. It's very sweet of you to come. Thank you.
So, the first question will be about how the development of Muslim political thought vis-a-vis the development in the Western world. Because if we look at the late Enlightenment period of Europe, especially the 17th, 18th century, if we look at the development of the European Western political thought, there have been centered around the individual. For example, people like John Stuart Mill, David Hume, Adam Smith, so on and so forth. And this has shaped an outlook which individuals are at the centerpiece of political theory. However, in the Muslim world, we did not see this kind of development, especially in the same time frame as the development of European political thought. Can you brief us what actually happened during that time in the development of Muslim political theory?
Well, it's a very important distinction that you're making. I think, first of all, what I'd like to say is that I think sometimes we overplay the need to compare between Western political thought and Islamic political thought. And as you quite rightly say, there are different roots, there are different cultural traditions here. So in a way, it's not quite fair to be able to draw a comparison and say one is better than the other. Having said that, it is clear that Islamic political thought has put emphasis upon a couple of things. One, the role of leadership and authority. And as you know, we have this kind of medieval discussion about the powers of the caliphate, in particular Mawardi and his writings on the rules of governance. And that, it has been developed through his writings and others. The other stream of thought which has occurred is the kind of development on community or the ummah, as opposed to, say, the individual. And I think those follow from the kind of emphasis that Islam has always placed on both that one should obey authority and those in authority among you, as the Quran says in many references, but also that individuals fulfill their potential and achieve their destiny as part of a larger community, a society, whatever. And so I think that has been clearly the impulse, which has been somewhat different from, as you say, the Enlightenment thinking that occurred from sort of 17th, particularly the 18th century on in the West. Now, this does not mean, as you would know, this does not mean that the two traditions, the two different kinds of political thought, don't start to interact with each other, and that there is a response from the Muslim world. That probably doesn't occur until really the 19th century. And when we know, for example, the famous period of the Tanzimat in the Ottoman period, where there is partly for political reasons the direct intrusion of Western imperialism, Western ideas, etc., but also, in a way, the intellectual response to that, the beginning of the idea that there should be rights as well as privileges, that there should be limitations on the powers of the governors. Now, I think that we shouldn't lose the larger picture, that doesn't mean that there never was limitations on the powers of the governors. That, of course, is clearly part of Islamic teaching and traditions. Rulers should rule, but they should do so justly. And it is always left open the direct question of whether or not if they do not rule justly, can you disobey them? Can there be, in a sense, protest, revolution, etc.? That was never quite settled. That was never quite taken on directly. And then until we get to, say, from the 19th century on, where the sort of Western tinged ideas of liberalism do begin to have a direct influence.
Yeah. Speaking about justice and in the political realm, in the Muslim world, if we, not to raise the comparison thing, if we look at the development of Muslim political thought, especially after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there's quite a vacuum on the idea of political justice, how to distribute goods and power justly in the framework of the nation states. So, in your opinion, what's the factor of this kind of development compared to the Western world?
Well, again you make an important point here, and I do think that there's always been, as I've said, there's always been some emphasis upon justice. Now, how is justice classically conceived? It's classically conceived as a kind of a balance. And you know that there is this kind of metaphor or Quranic trope which talks about mizan, or balance, and that therefore if elements are in some form of balance,
in harmony,
it's a harmony. As it creates this harmony, that in itself is a form of justice. Now, there are implications from that. The implications are, first of all, that you put emphasis upon complementarity rather than equality. And I think that is probably one of the conceptual, intellectual reasons why the idea of a sort of a distributive justice comes on late. In the Islamic world, because this idea of that it should be a complementary distribution of power, of influence, of status, etc., rather than an equal one, probably accounted for why the sense of responsibility for an equal distribution doesn't occur. Doesn't occur until later. And another is, and we know this just to take one example in the modern period, we know that Sayyid Qutb, for example, preferred to speak about social justice rather than political justice. And although, of course, there were great political implications to what he wrote about, the direct sort of conceptualization of political justice, I think, doesn't occur. It's more that if we can get a society which is just, it therefore will be Islamic. And that what is more important is, the tension that has always been occurred is, to put it very simply, do you kind of reform the society from below, in which you get a kind of a just and therefore Islamic society. And if you do that, you will eventually get the proper Islamic leadership of that society. It will flow from the conditions of society. I think that's been the impulse of most of Islamic thinking. Now, that of course is being questioned by many who would give a more top-down approach now, who will say the leadership must be just, and it must give create the conditions for the change of society.
Thank you. So you mentioned just now about the Muslim Ummah, because now one of the big problems is to conceptualize. Sorry about that. In our effort to conceptualize the Ummah, especially after the collapse of the Ottomans, after World War II, after the expansion of the nation-state institutions, can we still look at the Muslim Ummah as a community of the believers with a political connotation?
This, I think, is probably one of the most important issues facing the Muslim world today. As you know, the impulse towards the ummah, the sense that there should be an ummah is powerful and strong. And, you know, whether you call this Muslim solidarity, you call it Muslim fraternity, whatever you call it, there is that strong sense of belongingness that goes across the Muslim world. And a sense of affiliation and almost identity to some extent. I think that's deeply rooted in all of these Islamic traditions which have been carried on. It's been transferred through education, transferred through common rituals like the Hajj. It's been transferred through symbols that are common across the various regions of the Muslim world. So I think that's powerful. To make the jump from that to a political community, I think is a jump too far. I think this is something that many people have argued for, and they're in a way always searching for it. I'm skeptical about the possibilities of this. I think the political realities are of entrenched nationalisms, entrenched differences, both political and social, such that it would be difficult to override them to create a kind of unity. Now, we're finding, we can talk about this later, but we're finding now with the supposed caliphate of the Islamic